Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has struggled to redefine itself on the world stage. Today, though, Russia appears much bolder, more confident and ready to exert its authority. So what is this Russian sphere of influence, and how does this affect the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Hamish MacDonald. Thanks very much for joining us on this edition of the programme. Whether it's Vladimir Putin riding topless on horseback or Russia showing off its military prowess, the country is very clearly flexing its muscle. The Soviet Union was for a time a superpower. Since it crumbled, Russia has taken almost 2 decades to reshape its image on the world stage. Almost every day, though, Russia is in the global headlines. Its influence runs far and wide. In the past week, Russia was the first country to recognise the self-proclaimed government of Kyrgyzstan, which claims it'll even get financial support from Moscow. Critics, though, say that Russia went much further, actively supporting a coup. In Poland, it's been a week of tragedy. But in this moment of grief, it seems there's been a step towards reconciliation. The plane crash, which killed the Polish president, Lech Kaczynski, and 96 others, has helped to mend fences between Poland and Russia. In the Ukraine too, relations between the two countries have warmed since the re-election of the pro-Russian Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych in February. Ukraine, like much of Europe, depends heavily on Russia for its energy needs. But Russian influence stretches much further, of course. There's the Caucasus, Afghanistan, Iran, and well beyond. We'll explore all of those issues on this programme. Joining me today for the debate from Moscow, we have Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with RIA Novosti news agency. That's the state news agency in Russia. Alexander Nekrasov is a former advisor to President Boris Yeltsin. He's with us from London. And back in Moscow, we have Fred Weir. He is from the Christian Science Monitor. He's the correspondent there in Russia. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. Let's begin, if we can, with Alexander Nekrasov in London. Do you have any doubts about whether Russia had a hand to play in what we've seen occurring in Kyrgyzstan over the last week or so? Let's start there, because I guess that's been at the forefront of the news headlines.
Well, I think Russia had every right to act quickly and swiftly, because Russia has to look after its interests. The situation is that the war in Afghanistan and it's spreading to Pakistan has created a serious tension in the region as a whole, and the fundamentalist groups all across the region are becoming more active. So Russia doesn't need Kyrgyzstan to become some fundamentalist hot point and create a crisis there.
I don't know whether you answered my question, though. It was, did Russia play a hand? Was it instrumental in the downfall of the government there?
Well, when you say instrumental, you mean that were they funding the opposition and were they guiding the opposition? I have no knowledge of that. I have no proof of that. I've seen no proof of that. And I think that the regime of the previous president was corrupt, and that we know, and that there was a deep disappointment among the people of the country with the regime. So I don't really think that Russia basically sort of, organized it or financed it. I think it responded quickly simply because it didn't want the crisis to get out of control.
Dmitry Babich, your take on this? Because, of course, there's suggestion that Russia has the ability to influence gas prices in Kyrgyzstan. It did influence those prices in the weeks leading up to this. And, of course, the Kyrgyz opposition was hosted at the Kremlin shortly before these protests began.
Well, I also don't think that Russia had a role in these events for a simple reason. When similar events happened 5 years ago, that revolution in 2005 was called a tulip revolution, and it was seen in Russia as one more link in the chain of revolutions that shook the regimes in Georgia and in Ukraine. So it was perceived very negatively in Russia. And now, if we look at the list of the opposition leaders, these are the same people who organized the coup in 2005. So I don't think Russia was interested in ousting Bakiyev, because actually Russia had an agreement with Bakiyev. It invested heavily in his regime by funding, for example, the construction of a hydraulic electric power station in Kyrgyzstan, and a few other projects. The only problem was that Bakiyev, in return, was supposed to remove an American base which he didn't do because he also wanted to take money from Americans. There was no geopolitical but only financial problem behind it.
All right, let's bring in Fred.
basically,
Let's bring in
both the
Fred
United
Weir at
States
that
and
point,
Russia were not interested.
I'd like to gauge his view on this issue of the Manas Air Base. The US pays $60 million a year to rent that site. Is that really the only reason why the US and Russia see Kyrgyzstan as being so important?
Well, if you're asking me, I think that Kyrgyzstan is a critical test for Russia in its ability to control, to manage affairs in its own former region, which is paramount. It is the first priority of Russian foreign policy to get the former Soviet space, minus of course the Baltic states and so on, back under its hegemony. And I think the evidence is circumstantial that Russia probably, if they didn't play a role in the Kyrgyz coup, they were certainly informed of it in advance. We do know that it was in planning for quite a while. And Kyrgyz leaders are saying that they did inform the Kremlin about it. And we know that Rosa Otunbayeva visited Moscow last month, met with Putin. Hard to believe that she didn't discuss this matter with him. But it doesn't mean that Moscow orchestrated events or anything like that. And there is also no doubt that Russia's pretty pleased with this change because they were visibly dissatisfied with Bakiyev.
All right, then. Let's go back to Alexander Nekrasov in London. You've worked inside the Kremlin. What is this so-called sphere of influence that we talk about these days in relation to Russia? What is that region and what does it actually mean?
Well, first of all, Russia lost its empire, as we know, in 1991, and Russia has to regain its position in all those regions. Now, unfortunately, Russia responds to events rather than dictates those events. And I actually think that, very briefly, in Kyrgyzstan, it was responding to events rather than dictating them. The same applies to Ukraine and Northern Caucasus and Caucasus itself. Again, Russia is responding to events rather than dictating them. And that's, I think, the biggest disadvantage of its foreign policy at the moment. But on the other hand, of course, any country like Russia, big country with nuclear arsenals and long-term interests across the world, will have to look after its interests in the vicinity. Look at the Americans, they're doing the same. Look at even Britain, look at any other country in Europe, they're doing exactly the same. So it's, politics are basically an extension of the economy. And I think that, personally, I think that the West still has suspicions about Russia's intentions, and this, I think, causes problems in Europe. And I think basically that Russia's role in Europe will be diminishing, because with each country joining NATO and the EU, I think the role of Russia in those countries will be weak. But as regards Central Asia and the Northern Caucasus and Caucasus themselves, I think Russia has to defend its interests there simply because of the tension that is growing in Asia, with the war in Afghanistan spreading to Pakistan and more countries being dragged into it. And I think the Americans really have to sort out their act in Afghanistan, because it's really getting out of control there, and there is no chance that there is a military solution to Afghanistan. They need to start talking to the moderates among the Taliban.
All right, then I think this is probably a convenient point for us to broaden this debate out a little bit, because of course it's not just in the former Soviet states that Russia seems to be exerting some influence. It's one of the largest suppliers of energy to Europe. Russia also managed to get the US to modify its controversial missile shield defense plans in Poland and the Czech Republic. Now, while the West is keen for Russia to implement sanctions on Iran, Russia continues to forge relations with Tehran. In America's backyard, Russia has even cut deals with Venezuela, agreeing a $5 billion arms deal. And last week, Russia signed a landmark treaty with the US in a nuclear pact, agreeing to reduce the atomic arsenal of the former Cold War rivals. Let's throw this over to Dmitry Babich now. How much of this do you think is about Vladimir Putin's view of the world and, if you like, a bit of a cult of Putin?
Certainly, Vladimir Putin seems to have a very big role to play in Russian politics, But I don't quite agree with the view that Russia is such a powerful country that it can influence and re-establish its hegemony over Central Asia. I don't think so, for a very simple reason. Basically, this is an impoverished region which is seething deeper and deeper into poverty and worse, illiteracy. And this is a problem that the whole world will have to deal with, not only Russia. Russia would love to just leave these territories alone and not care about them, but it's impossible because we have open borders with them. Historically, it would be a terrible tragedy if we close these borders, because then Kyrgyz won't be able to get to get some money from migrant workers working in Russia. So basically, I don't think Russia is a superpower. I think Russia is an important regional power trying to re-establish its interest in the closest areas to its borders, but still no chance of re-establishing the Soviet Union. And as for Venezuela, I don't believe that it's serious. I think that Russia is just dealing with this country simply because it's one of the few partners, more or less sensible partners, which we can deal with directly. You know, most of the NATO countries have an unofficial order from the United States not to buy weapons from Russia. So where can we sell our weapons? Venezuela, China, India, and the Middle East countries sometimes.
All right, Fred Weir, your take on all of this, because one does get the sense that Moscow probably quite likes to keep the West on its toes a bit. You know, talk nicely to them, but at the same time, maybe do some deals with characters and countries that Washington doesn't particularly trust.
Okay, I think we journalists often take these sorts of things, add them up, and get a completely wrong sum. Russia is in no way like the Soviet Union. It's fundamentally different. It no longer has an ideology that it promotes as a global alternative. And it doesn't really have grand geopolitical ambitions like the Soviet Union did. On the other hand, it is a great power, and it is returning to some of those positions in a new way. And there is no doubt that Russia is something a little bit different. It's on the outs with the global system. It's not a developed Western European country. It will never be admitted to NATO. It's too big.
Fred, Weir, if that's the case, why are they so aggressively trying to prevent the expansion of NATO?
Well, this is their region. This is a bottom line. The former Soviet region is where Dmitry Medvedev actually more or less explicitly said, this is our sphere of influence. And actually, when they do things like send bombers and naval squadrons to Venezuela, they are pricking the Americans and in a way provoking them by saying, look, this is what you're doing to us. Pay attention. There's a propaganda element to it, as well as a frankly commercial thing, and it's not what I'm saying is it's not a coincidence that Russia is attracting to itself some of those countries that the United States regards as rogue states, like Venezuela or Iran and so on, because they are also on the outs, and they will find a natural arms trading partner with Russia and so on, and this is how it's going to be. But we mustn't think that Russia is actually got a systemic ambition to take over the world in the way that the Soviet Union probably did.
Okay, then, Alexander Nekrasov, do you think that Moscow does play, in some ways, a double game, in that it appears to be cooperating with particularly the United States? You know, there was all that talk about resetting the relationship after Obama came to power, yet at the same time trying to wrestle back influence in a particular region, trying to prevent the expansion of NATO, trying to exert influence over a certain number of countries?
Well, I think you should always remember that there are two agendas in the Russian foreign policy. One is sort of for the view of the outside world, and the other one is for the domestic consumption. And the domestic audience wants to see Russia standing up to America and reviving its strength and its armed forces and so on. And a lot of things that are happening, you should always divide them into those two spheres. And I don't really think that Russia will ever pose a threat to America. And I don't even think that Russia can actually pose a threat to anybody else, including Europe. Now, the reason you mentioned NATO, the reason NATO is a sort of irritant for Russia is because NATO was created to basically fight Russia, fight against the Soviet Union. So the question that many people in Moscow are asking is why? Why do you need a military alliance that was created to actually defend itself from Russia, from the former Soviet Union? Why do you need to spread it further on? It doesn't really make any sense anymore. And that is why I think that particular issue is causing sort of irritation in Moscow itself. But on the other hand, I would never accept that obviously Russia poses any threat at all to the West. I think the West should work closely.
But what about
Russia.
Western interests though? Because that's the far more realistic scenario. A country like Georgia, perhaps a country like Kyrgyzstan, where there's a pretty important US military base. Does Russia pose a threat in that way?
No, Russia doesn't pose a threat in that way at all. And I think that basically, if we take the war between Russia and Georgia, it was a huge mistake on the part of both countries. I think it was a disaster in a sense of foreign policy. I think if I were Putin, I would sack my whole team, the foreign secretary and others. Because
I don't know if you've still got your job
disaster.
in the Kremlin, Alexander Nekrasov, but I mean, if that's the case, let's just look at Kyrgyzstan though. I mean, effectively, didn't Russia try to buy off them the whole leasing of the Manas Air Base to the United States with a pretty sizable grant?
Well, first of all, this is business. Have you ever heard that the Americans were pussycats when they conduct business? Oh, they're tough guys. If they want oil, they'll go for it. Now America, for example, wants oil from Africa. Are they talking to anybody? They just go in and take over. So this is not, to say that, the Russians are aggressive in their economic policy and all the others are just sitting there and looking at it. Of course it's fighting for its interests in the former Soviet Union sphere, and it should be doing this because how else do you compete in this very competitive world of ours?
Dmitry Babich, is it business or a bit of politics too?
Well, basically, Kyrgyzstan is a very poor country, so there is absolutely no economic interest in Kyrgyzstan. The reason why Kyrgyzstan is so unstable and they have coups every 5 years, unlike neighboring Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, is just because they are so poor. They are the smallest and the poorest country in the region. As for Russia, I would correct a little bit Alexander about Georgia. I think what happened was a tragedy, but basically the Russian leadership has two main objectives. The first one is to keep the power and money with the group that actually has it and that basically took it in the early 90s, to preserve this elite. And the second one, to integrate this elite into the Western elite. But the first objective is by far more important than the second one. So when Saakashvili attacked South Ossetia 2 years ago, the first objective was threatened. If Russia had just looked at it and gone away, it would not have been respected. The internal power of the regime would be shattered. So they just had no other choice but to go in, shattering their second objective. It postponed integration of Russian elite into the Western one, but it protected the first objective.
All right, I think probably what we'll do now is just talk about potential weaknesses, because I think we've reached that point in the discussion. So how much of Russia's image as a world power is a myth and how much of it is a reality? Well, its nuclear bombers are permanently airborne, but there are serious questions now about its contemporary military power. NATO's eastern border, of course, is literally only a short drive from St. Petersburg these days. On the security front, the latest Moscow subway bombings show that violence in the North Caucasus had never really been contained. Economically, Russia still depends largely on Western markets buying its oil and natural gas. They are essentially at the mercy of the markets. As well as that, the bulk of Russia's financial assets are in the West, and access to them could in theory be blocked. When it comes to numbers, well, Russia's population falls by around 800,000 people every year. Putting it into context, its population is double that of Britain, but the UK's gross national product is worth almost twice as much as Russia's. Fred Weir, when you put it like that, it sounds as though Russia's a pretty unstable place and probably should be on its knees.
Well, it's not on its knees, and it is recovering. It is a country which has pretty great underlying strengths. But everything you said is right, and Russia is seriously economically underdeveloped. Its military is now going through a reform period in which it's almost incapable of doing anything, which is one of the reasons why Russia recently revised its nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold for use of nuclear weapons, because basically its nuclear deterrent is all it's got for the foreseeable future. When Russia does fully re-emerge, it will be an important power. And it does seem likely, at least I would bet on Russia staying together, and all of the fears that it was going to break up and so on that were common in the 1990s never came true, and they're not likely to. But you should not overestimate Russia as a power on the global stage. It isn't, it won't be, and it will do deals. But in its own region, and this is what we were talking about, in the former Soviet Union, it will be more assertive. It has shown the ability to be take a much longer view, a kind of chess master view of things. That's why Ukraine has come around, and Ukraine is back in the Russian fold to all intents and purposes. That's probably the case in Kyrgyzstan, and you will see this much more so. Russia will assert itself very strongly, and it is about politics.
Alexander Nekrasov, I think you touched on this earlier in our discussion. You mentioned that you think Russia has a trust issue. The West doesn't really trust it. It kind of has some concerns about Russia and what its motivations are. I mean, 50% of the country's income comes from its energy that it supplies, particularly to Europe. Yet every year there's this kind of debate in Europe about whether Russia's going to turn off the gas pipelines and the gas supplies. I mean, Russia's never really going to do that, is it?
No, of course, Russia depends on those markets. And when I hear some Russian officials saying, well, we can always start selling oil and gas to other countries, I think that is total rubbish, of course. The European market is crucial for Russia's development. And I think we should actually, you know, for once in our lives concede one thing. Russia will always be Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons. It will always sell mineral resources to the outside world. Its infrastructure is basically, you know, not developed at all. Its manufacturing industry is just laughable. If you look at the way they're trying to build a new generation of the nuclear warhead Bulava, they just can't get it off the ground, you know. So the former sort of mighty industrial base of the Soviet Union, which is Russia now, it doesn't exist anymore. So Russia has to sort itself out and just decide one thing. Are we going to use the money we're getting from our natural resources wisely, invest it into infrastructure, into roads and other things? And are we going to raise the standards of living of our people? Or are we going to waste this money on cheap, silly gimmicks? You know, signing macho deals with Venezuela and India as if we can provide all those arms to them and weapons. We can't do that. There's absolutely no chance we can produce them. So I think the most important thing for the leadership in Russia is to decide what is going to happen next. Okay. And next is going to be, the most important thing is to spend this money wisely.
We'll have to leave that as our final thought. Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons. That's the assessment of Russia from our panel. Thank you all of you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. In Moscow, we had Dmitry Babich. In London, Alexander Nekrasov, and also in Moscow from the Christian Science Monitor, Fred Weir. Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. All you need to do is email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me and the team, thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.